Good morning to everyone. I'm sorry to have been a little bit late. So what we are talking about today is the results of the international systems that are run by WIPO in respect of the filing of international patent applications under our PCT, Patent Cooperation Treaty, international applications under the Madrid Agreement, international trademark applications under the Madrid Agreement, and Madrid system, and international design applications under the Hague system. Why are these of interest? Because these systems are attracting ever greater participation on the part of countries around the world, and they, in some respects, I think it's reasonable to say, they represent the most strong IP applications around the world, because these are not a simple national application, but they're an application that can cover, up to 152 countries for the Patent Cooperation Treaty, 118 for the Madrid Agreement, and 60 or so for the Hague system. So, of the number of filings that you would get domestically in one country, a certain proportion of those are then internationalised, and mainly, but not exclusively, but mainly through our systems. So they're quite a good measure of the strength of what might be considered some of the best intellectual property applications around the world. I would have 5 messages, I suppose, for you. And they're fairly similar to messages to the ones that we've spoken about in recent years. However, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's not perhaps news, but it does confirm a certain number of trends. So the first one is, volumes continue to increase. In our systems, volumes of international applications, just as volumes of applications around the world, when you aggregate all the domestic applications, increase. So we had good growth in our Patent Cooperation Treaty, and for the first time, more than 250,000 international patent applications were filed with us, 253,000. And that was an increase of some 3.9%, nearly 4% over the preceding year. For the first time, we went over the 60,000 mark for international trademark applications, up to 61,200, and that was a 6.4 increase. And designs is always a much smaller system at this stage, but it's about 5,400 applications. So that's a continuing story that we've heard of now for some time, but the trend is confirmed once again. Secondly, Asia, another message that we have been giving for some years now. So significantly, for the first time, Asia filed more than 50% of all international patent applications. Asia, 50.1%. So 50.5%, thank you, Ms. Hyde. 50.5% of all international applications. So look, historically, this is quite extraordinary. If you take, we do this on a yearly basis, but historically, this is really a momentous occasion. This is something that is a very, very significant result. And
does it mean that all the stolen technologies from Asia are returned back to Asia now?
Well, I don't know where to start with a question like that. Every word would need to be parsed, I think. So I'll pass on that one for one moment. I think if you look at the top filing companies under the Patent Cooperation Treaty, the PCT, now, if I'm not mistaken, 6 of the top 10 are from Asia. If you can just quickly verify that I'm speaking the truth there.
No, it's China, Japan, Korea.
I don't think I made it up.
So under the PCT, we have 3 out of the top 10.
Six from Asia.
You could
Six
say
from Asia.
Yes. China, Japan, and Korea. Those are the
Yep.
Korea, sorry. Six from Asia.
6 of the top 10 filing
Top
companies.
six from
company.
Yeah. So if you look at who's filing, 6 of the top 10 companies filing are from Asia. China, from Japan, from Korea, Republic of Korea. So that's a consistent message, but look, it's really an important one because we are watching geopolitical shift in a number of respects, and in the area of technology, this is a very clear trend that is confirmed once again. Now, the third message, I suppose, would be, again, a fairly consistent message, which is China. So China, the gap between the United States of America and China in numbers of international patent applications filed is closing. And if somewhat is closing, okay, it's closing. So you had last year, 2018, United States filing 56,142 international patent applications. 56,142. China, coming out of China, filed 53,345. So the gap is not quite 3,000. Now, in terms of percentage, 22.2%, right, coming out of the United States, 21.1% coming out of China. So we've seen that gap closing, but it's getting very close now. 21.1, China. So it's getting close now, and we would expect, but this is assuming similar growth rates or similar filing patterns, that China will pass the United States in the next 2 years. So this is another fairly significant, of course, development. And we are seeing this occur with respect to corporations filing. So the top filer was Huawei. Huawei filed 5,400 applications, 5,405 applications.
The same Huawei of China, which is under attack.
It's Huawei of China. Yes, I don't know any other Huawei's. So it's the top corporate filer, and by quite a long way. The next is Mitsubishi Electric Corporation of Japan at 2,812. Okay. We also see Chinese universities appear now in the top 10 filing universities under the PCT. So the top is still the University of California, okay, followed by MIT. Shenzhen University comes in 3rd place. South China University of Technology in 4th place. So corporations and universities. So that's a fairly consistent message. Now, my next message would be that, and here I'm going to stick my neck out a little bit because 1 year is not a trend, but I would say India has joined the race. Okay, so now it remains to be seen whether...
Seriously said.
I would say that India has joined the race. Now, a lot of things happen in the course of a race, you know, and you have to see how everyone performs in the race, and that's a different thing, but they've joined the race, I'd say. And India went up by 27% in international patent applications last year. So they're still a relatively low filer, but they are, with China, one of two middle-income countries in the top 15 filers now. I caution you that 1 year's results are not a trend, and so we need to watch what happens in the race, but I would say they've started. Okay? That's an interesting development. And by the way, it does spread the geography of Asian participation a little wider. We've had, of course, Japan for many years, China, Korea, now India. The volumes are much lower for India. India, we're talking about 2013. So it's much, China is 56,000, okay? So it's a very big difference. But in percentage terms, it's an interesting evolution, and let's see. It's 1 year, as I said. Now, I've spoken a lot about technology because I think it's the area that everyone is most interested in. But very briefly, good results in the trademark system too, and we see now good growth for several years in the Madrid system in international patent applications. Interestingly, the US tops trademark filings as well as patent filings. I mean, when we talk about shift, let's not forget that the United States is the top filer of international patent applications and is the top filer of international trademark applications. So it's not like they've disappeared off the map. They're the top filers in numbers. But good growth from a number of countries in this system, in particular, again, it's fairly strong growth from Asia with Korea growing by 26%, Japan by 22%. The US, by the way, grew by 12%, 11.9%. So that's, I think, interesting to see this system grow into one which will give us a better measurement of branding worldwide, I think, as the numbers increase and the geography of participation increases. So that's, I think, all I wanted to say. But Carsten, I'll invite, if I may, Carsten to say a few words, who normally is more cautious and corrects me. So Carsten, please.
Yeah, thank you, Director General. I would not have a lot to add. Just on the last point, Madrid applications, to highlight that the growth is again mostly driven by Asian countries, and I think the large figures are coming from the Northeast Asian countries, China, the Republic of Korea, Japan. I think Japan quite significantly, 22.8%. That's a remarkable growth figure. But also in the United States, we have seen applicants from the United States increase by 12%. I think it's also noteworthy, even though the absolute numbers are much smaller, we are also seeing significant growth from other Asian economies. So again, India, we have 30% growth from 234 to 308 in the case of the Madrid system. And also interesting to note that the number of Southeast Asian countries, notably Thailand and Indonesia, that have joined the system very recently, applicants from those countries are also taking up the system, and we would expect that growth to continue, especially as other ASEAN countries join the system, as it becomes much more attractive to use. So if you have exporters, for example, in Indonesia, Thailand, the Philippines, who export a lot to the region and would mainly file trademarks within the region, they would find it much more attractive to use the system as the membership in that region grows. So I think these are the only observations I would add at this point. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions?
we could approach the issue the other way around. How do you explain that Latin America, where there are not only idiots and where there are good universities and where motivation should be even higher than anywhere else to leave their name and trace of their invention somewhere, account for, I think, less than 1% of the total. Yes. Not to speak of Africa, but that was more, let's say, predictable. But North Africa, I think, if my calculation, the rough calculation is correct, is 0.02%. The rest of Africa. The only success story in Latin America is Panama jumping from 9 to 185, which breaks all
records.
Record. So, of course, my question is not to speak good or ill of the continent, but to see the distortions which this.
I'm not sure they're distortions, but let's take it. So first of all, I think it's a very, very pertinent, if I may say, question. So, of course, we are surmising here. And I think surmising, we are, speculating here. So I think there are several factors. One factor is that there is not the same participation in our systems on the part of Latin American countries as there is from other regions in the world. So, for example, Argentina, which is a G20 economy, is not a member of the PCT.
It's not a member.
It's not a member of the PCT, and there are 153 countries.
But their candidate is going to contest for the elections, no?
Well, that's a different question, you know. So that's one example of, that's because they are filing through another country or through a subsidiary in another country. Okay, so we trace it back. So the geographical participation from Latin America in our systems, and this is particularly the case for Madrid, is less than for other regions. Secondly, there are obvious differences in technological capacity around the world. Now, that's a complex question to measure. This is one measure, but it's by no means a perfect measure, and there are lots of other, measures that one would have to take into account. But there is a technological capacity difference. And to some extent, what we see here reflects some of that as well, is another indicator of those technological capacity differences. And then I would say, thirdly, and this is the most speculative part of the answer, technology is moving at an extremely rapid pace now. And we need to be very careful that the disparities in technological capacity around the world are not exacerbated or worsened rather than improved in the current context of the world. And these figures are a contribution to measuring what's happening, and they're a contribution, and they're not, as I said, perfect reflections of anything.
FP and then Rafi.
It's a very simple question about how the system works. Does it say that it's the number of applications received by WIPO? But does it mean that an application that you receive is necessarily valid? Or are you, because then maybe a country is finding a lot of applications, but then a certain number is not valid, then it doesn't mean that, it doesn't really reflect the...
It's a very good question, and it goes to a subject that's often discussed, which is the quality of the applications. So these are numbers, It's a quantitative measure. It's not a qualitative measure. You're quite right, these are applications, they're not granted patents.
After by WIPO.
They're not, well, actually the system works that the grant is finally made by each of the countries that are designated in the application. So a certain part of the processing is done at the international level or in an international phase. The final decision to grant or deny is with each country or region in the case of Europe, at the European Patent Office.
So why don't you count the one who are really valid at the end? Because
Well, we do that for worldwide applications. We do that. But in our system, you know, you would be measuring what's happened 5 years ago because the processing time is long, you see. So applications are a measure. You've just pointed out quite correctly, they're an imperfect measure of technological strength and quality. Yeah, but they are an indicator, you know, that we have to pay attention to.
A couple of questions. The very first question is, in terms of revenue, how much has it jumped for you? Because PCT is your cow, which is sort of, what exactly is the quantum of revenue figures?
So our result last year, in 2018, having closed our books, but they're unaudited yet, so the auditors, 42 million. Surplus. No. Our surplus as an organisation last year was 42 million Swiss francs.
Yeah.
Okay, that's the closed accounts. As yet, the auditors are still, you know, auditing, so it's not the final result, but it's not going to be much different from that.
Is that a record high?
No, but it's a good result.
I see.
It's a good result.
I mean, coming back to the number of, you of course answered her as well as this question, namely the quality of patents remains a major issue. And often China is accused of stealing patents or forced technology transfers. Is there any way you get a kind of an assessment on those issues which the Americans keep raising without evidence?
So, look, I think you've, if I may say, Ravi, there are several issues that you've put into that. One, this has nothing to do with so-called forced technology transfer.
Yeah.
Okay, so nothing we've presented here is any, you know, has anything to do with that. It doesn't have anything to do with theft of technology, alleged theft of technology either, because a very small percentage of patent applications do not get granted because they have been stolen, as it were, the technology from someone else. That's patents are not granted. A patent is not granted on an application in a number of cases because the technology is, to use our technical term, anticipated. That is, it's not novel, and that's what the processing is all about, actually, is determining novelty and inventiveness or non-obviousness. So that's not, you know, it's got nothing to do with these figures again. And then we come to quality, you know, look, I keep saying, if we had a measure of quality of patent applications, you wouldn't need a venture capital industry. You know, we'd all know what to invest in. You know, so there are a lot of factors that enter into what makes a good, marketable piece of technology. And it's not just the strength of the technology, it's also the market, the take-up, the the marketing, a lot of factors enter into the picture. And there are some technologies, for example, the television was disclosed in a patent application 30 years before it was commercialised. The jet engine, something similar. There are many examples of this. So commercialisation, which is, what do you mean by quality? Do you mean the one that earns the most money, or do you mean the best piece of technology? No, it's well, what do I mean by quality? For a start, we don't know what we mean by quality. Is it a patent that is not going to be contested, or if it is contested in a court and where you say it's potentially invalid, the court, it's a strong patent that will not get overturned in a court challenge. So we're not quite sure what we mean by quality for a start, whether it's commercial, technological or legal quality. And then we can't measure it at this stage. It's one of those things that if you can measure, you measure retrospectively. And you would be measured retrospectively on those criteria by saying, did it stand the test of time? No, it didn't get invalidated over 10 years. Or it earned a certain amount of money, and that itself is a trick to be able to attribute profits to a particular patent, or it's found broad market acceptance and social acceptance. So we all, and particularly Carsten and Zaid, you might like to add something, Carsten, on this. It's a very difficult question.
Yeah.
We're all working on.
I mean, just maybe to underscore that the last thing that the Director General mentioned has been done. So there are studies that, in some sense, have looked after patents have expired. How much income have these patents generated? These studies exist for the United States, for many European countries, for Japan. What they universally show is that there is a highly skewed distribution of patent values. There are very few patents that, count for a lot of value, for billions and billions of dollars. There are many patents that have very little value, and that, in some sense, just reflects the uncertainty of the innovation process, where even the companies, when they file these patents, are not sure what is going to happen to the technology, what is going to happen to markets. So at least some ex post measures do exist, but looking into the future, it's of course difficult to know. The patents that we're talking about here, are very new inventions, very difficult to say what's going to happen to them in their lifetime.
Just come back to Huawei. It's also the largest patent filer among the companies. Again, here the same criticism that, namely, is there any way that your figures or your assessment will help the world view, which is being colored by what the American security people keep saying, that it poses the greatest threat? Is there any way of knowing this?
Well, no, I think, look, I'm off the track of our patent applications here, but, we're lacking transparency in so many areas in the world.
Criticisms that are leveled.
Well, that's a political dispute that's out there, and we can't really comment on that. What we can say simply is that Huawei is a strong user of the patent system and is filing almost twice as the number of patent applications of any other company in the world through the international system. I mean, we can say that. And that's for you to evaluate what that means. But they're obviously a strong participant in the intellectual property system. I think the lady down here too.
Sorry, please, and then Tom. Sorry.
Juliette from Nikkei. I was wondering, because the number of patents grew, if the number of disputes had grown as well.
Yeah.
In the case of, for example, the Swatch Group that is suing Samsung, I was wondering if it goes via WIPO. I mean,
So we're trying to get a handle on that, and Mosaid and Carsten did a study on a preliminary study on patent litigation around the world to try to get some sort of to start to have a basis. It's a little difficult for various methodological reasons that my colleagues can explain to have a comprehensive picture. But you would expect normally that if there's a certain percentage of applications that attracts, that become the subject of dispute, then as the total number rises, the number of disputes would rise. And what we see in our arbitration and mediation centre, which is far from any perfect measure of anything, because you don't have to use alternative dispute resolution. You can use litigation, and so you've got to measure litigation, and alternative dispute resolution is a choice. But what we do see is that our number of cases on arbitration and mediation is slowly rising, and there are various reasons for that, and one may be the number of disputes of an international nature, because that's when you would use our service. But Carsten or Mosaid, on any comments on litigation measures?
Right. We published a few figures in our latest World Intellectual Property Indicators report that we published in December. I would need to look myself at the precise figures. Maybe Mosaid knows them. I think generally it is true, as the number of patent applications has grown, so have the number of disputes. But there's also a lot of variation across jurisdictions, a lot of fluctuations over time. So I'm not sure if you recall specific numbers.
I can send you the link for that study we did last year in December. The numbers of our customers is very small, and it's technically specific, so certain sectors there might be more than others. And we looked at 2 jurisdictions, US and UK. In terms of increase, there isn't any significant increase, but I have to look back into the reviews. I'll send you the link for this study.
Thank you. Tom.
Tom Myers from Reuters. I wondered if I could ask for a bit more, sorry if you addressed this, I'm too busy looking at data, but a bit more insight into 2 things. One is what on earth is going on at Chinese universities? The other one is, why are there these huge swings in the figures for the origins, especially in trademarks and industrial designs? US sort of down 22% and Japan up 22%. And these seem such huge year-to-year swings. What's going on? And also, can you put a bit more flesh on bones on Huawei? I obviously, you're not going to talk about the controversy, but have we ever seen anything like this? Or can you say anything about what's going on? Are they coming to this with a massive sort of fire hose of applications? Is it in one area? Is it across the pitch? Say more about Huawei, please. Thanks.
Okay, so huge swings. So look, my little contribution to start that one is that you have in the Patent Cooperation Treaty, I think, rather consistent trends, and the growth rates in those trends do differ. So for China, we've seen in previous years 20, 30% even, and it's now stabilising because the volume is obviously, much higher than for the growth rate. So that 8% growth on 50,000 is a lot, In the trademark area, that's where I think you're getting the swings. And my little contribution is that the system is not as mature as the Patent Cooperation Treaty. So the Patent Cooperation Treaty has had a relatively stable membership, or at least participation from the largest economies in the world for 20, 30 years. In the case of the Madrid system, what we've seen is that the United States is a relatively new member. It joined in the 1990s. Japan is a relatively new member. Korea is a relatively new member. India is a very new member. It's a couple of years only. And that's because The system was revised in the 1989 actually, and that you have to get take up of the new system, and then users have to say, well, that's a good system to use. So it doesn't have the same stability as a system nor coverage, for that matter, as the PCT.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, I think especially for the Madrid system and the Hague system, these are relatively smaller systems. And what we find is that sometimes the, let's say, strategies or decisions of a few companies, can have sort of countrywide impact. To give you one specific example, for example, Samsung under the Hague system, did file a significant number of applications 2 years ago. And over the last 2 years, it has declined somewhat. But because Samsung is such a large filer in proportion to all the filings in Korea, and even in terms of the overall system, that's where I would say these idiosyncrasies matter. Whereas for the large filers in the PCT system, we also see variations, but because it's such a large system, they don't necessarily show up as much in terms of the fluctuations. Having said that, I think what we saw in the case of Japan and the Madrid system was quite remarkable, and I think we will sort of also further study what may be behind that. I don't have an immediate answer because Japan has been a member of the Madrid system for a long time. We know domestically, and that we reported in December, there has been very significant growth in trademark applications in Japan, and that may translate into international applications as well. But I think there you're right to say, for an origin like Japan, that is quite a significant increase.
I can tell you what we think may be behind it also. It's not the complete explanation. We started through our Japan office individual visits to companies to explain the benefits of the system. So we think awareness of the system is part of the reason. Now, Chinese universities, look, I would just explain that. I would explain it on the basis that you have in China an extremely strong emphasis from the top on innovation and on all of the elements of the innovation ecosystem, one of which is intellectual property applications. And another of which is a strong educational system, and another of which is focusing on commercialization of basic research. You have, in addition, in China, the second largest R&D budget in the world in absolute terms. So you've got some $480 billion being invested in research and development in China now, compared to around about $540 billion in the United States. I might be a year out on my figures, but this is roughly what you have. Now, this is a huge amount of money, and where is it being invested? Well, in the Chinese system, a lot of that is invested by the state. If you compare it to the US system, you have a lot invested by the private sector, although a lot invested by the state. I wouldn't underestimate the amount. Look at the health budget of R&D in the United States of America. It's huge, the state health budget. So, but you do have a strong state influence and a state-driven policy in the case of China. And that translates into universities doing the research, the R&D, and then you have an emphasis on getting that to market. And China enacted in the last several years, I can't tell you exactly when, the equivalent of a Bayh-Dole Act. Bayh-Dole Act, you may be familiar with that, was a influential piece of legislation introduced in the United States of America in the 1980s, if I'm not mistaken, which was to try to ensure that the patents taken out on government-sponsored research were getting used, and there were various measures for that. And now China, in its study of studious, examination of market practices, adopted a similar piece of legislation, which may have, I'm saying may have had an influence on the attitude of Chinese universities towards commercialising their R&D. So I think all of those factors fit into a fairly coherent picture, which would explain why we're seeing greater participation on the part of Chinese universities.
Yeah, no, just one thing on Huawei. One thing we could get you is the technology breakdown of Huawei's filings, because these are all published PCT applications. I suspect it will show that, you know, the most important technology fields are digital communications and computer technology. But we can certainly extract those figures and send them to you.
And we can also say that it's an all-time record by anyone, the number by Huawei. So you can draw your own conclusions from that. And I think also it would be fair to say, well, Huawei is a technology company. You know, it's a technology company, and it is involved in the cutting edge. And so it's fairly normal for technology companies. Look at who follows Huawei. If I'm not mistaken, Qualcomm, or Mitsubishi Electric, and then Qualcomm. You know, sorry, Qualcomm. Yeah, which is a technology company. So these another way of looking at this, if you like, is these are stakes being made. This is my stake on this piece, my stake on this piece, by the various players in this field.
And John and then maybe Boris.
Yeah.
And then
Just a little clarification question. These international filings, have you checked that some are not attempts to evergreen? In other words, refiling to extend a patent, and does it count as a new filing or not?
Well,
You've
that
got a lot of cases, in one case before the Indian Supreme Court at
Yeah.
the moment.
Yeah. So that's part of the process that falls to the national level. So I said earlier, you know, there are certain, what we do is receive the application, we organise an international search of the application.
You don't know if it's original or an extension of a
Well,
foreign-
in the international phase, we receive it, we organise an international search, which will give you an international search report, which will indicate what, if any, previous technology has been identified that may have an impact on the novelty of the invention, right? It's a report. And an international preliminary examination or a preliminary report on patentability, which is non-binding, and it's an assessment, an evaluation, non-binding evaluation of whether there are barriers to patentability, either because it's not novel or because it's not sufficient. It's not sufficiently non-obvious,
But we don't
inventive.
know from the beginning if it's
So that takes some time. You know, it's a complex process, and then only when it enters the national level, it depends on what you mean by evergreening, and there are
trying to go.
different national. But I understand. Yeah, no, I understand. I understand. Well, yeah, but you know, it might be evergreen. Some people call a new use evergreening. Okay, so they, for example, applying a drug. This is an example from 10 or 15 or so years ago. I think they're applying a drug for lowering blood pressure, and they notice that the patient's hair starts growing again. You know, and so it's a different application of the same drug, you see. And now some would say that's evergreening, and some countries would say, no, it's a new use, and a new use is patentable if you discover a new use for an existing product. If you discover that it's got a use that nobody else has thought of, then that's patentable. So, you know, this is a complex area, and I don't think we can give any quick answers on it. Yeah.
Boris and Kjell.
Okay. I have a question regarding the trend of Chinese PCT applications. I see that actually the surge was really in 2016. So my first question would be whether it is related to the China 2025, because if I understood it was like approved by the Prime Minister in May 2015. So it's my first question.
It was what, sorry?
Related to the Made in China 2025. So basically the policy of changing to promote technologically developed systems.
Yeah.
And then I will have a follow-up.
Well, we're speculating here, and personally I would say it's part of a consistent trend in government policy. So you have had a very clear emphasis on innovation and the transformation of the economy to a higher value input, if you like, for several decades almost now, for a long time. So I would place it in that overall context, and the Made in China, the 2025 manufacturing, or any other of the number of strategies, the artificial intelligence strategy and so on, a number of different strategies are all part of the same picture. So that's would be my approach. Yeah.
Follow-up?
Yeah.
Well, true, but really when I see from the late 2000s, I think 2009,
Yeah.
except the surge was like 13,000 between 2015 and 2016, then the trend is like an increase of 4,000 per year in average.
Yeah.
So there is a surge that is extremely clear, and when we have a country in which the economy is controlled, as we know, I wanted to go to the second question, which was because the Made in China 2025 is no more mentioned in media or in statement by Chinese officials, because we know there are some discussions with the United States, and the United States is not happy with this Made in China. I was wondering whether you're confident that the trend in China will continue.
Predictions are very dangerous things, but I would be reasonably confident that this will continue. I would note, and this goes back to our previous discussion, that part of the IP strategy of China, the official IP strategy of China now, is to focus on the quality of applications. So, and if you were to take, just as an example, if you were to take Japan, because a number of factors enter into this. If you were to take Japan as an example, what we've seen in fairly recent years in Japan is that the overall number of applications domestically has been rather stagnant or declined a little bit. But the number of their international applications has been rising. So it reflects a different patenting strategy on the part of companies, where they're focusing on what they consider to be their best bets, they're very good applications, and they're spending their budget on getting international protection for them rather than by filing more applications domestically. So, I think there are quite a number of variables that enter into this. My bet would be the numbers will rise.
Maybe if I can point out one thing just to underscore that. Two things, just statistically, as the base grows, the percentage growth will, inevitably comes down, and I think that is what we have seen in the case of China. But it's also important to recognize, and that's why I would sort of venture to say that we will see continued growth in China that probably will be faster than in other countries. If you look at the Chinese figures in relation to the size of the Chinese economy, and you can, sort of take either population, GDP, number of firms, China is still, behind, especially the other advanced economies that you see, in the list here. In terms of domestic filings, for example, even though, China files more than twice as many patents as the United States in terms of per capita, they're still behind the United States. So in that sense, I think there's still a lot of growth potential, not least because also many Chinese companies are still in the process of internationalizing. So, it probably, or it may and may not be double digit, but I would expect the growth in China to be faster than in other countries.
FP and then Boris.
It's a follow-up from my previous question. So you say that this is the application, which registration of the applications. So you don't check if then after they are filed or not. And so I would like to know if you after you have those figures about the demands that finally were really validated, even if it's national level, and if you could give us an idea about for the US and for China, out of 100, how many were really in fact validated?
I'm not sure my colleagues have come in here, but we can give you several sort of indicators. So one, for a start, would be the total number of patents held by the total number of patents held by each country. So all of the patent applications, that have been filed in previous years that have made it through to grant of a patent. So what's the stock? And we can tell you that. And of course it's a retrospective measure, and it's a bit behind. One of the beauties of the patent applications is that's the latest activity, whereas these grants reflect activities from 5-10 years ago. So that's one thing we could say. We could also say the number of what we call patent families held by the different countries, and Masaid can give you all this. And a patent family is considered to be one of the indicators of quality because the grant has been made in more than one country. And the measure we usually use is Europe, Japan, United States, I think. So if you've got a grant in each of those, it's a reasonably good indicator that's a fairly strong application. So there are various things that we can dance around your question.
There's a different way of looking at it, but the problem is, like Jill mentioned, there'll be a time lag. So you've got to be aware of that. I cannot tell you exactly how many have applied in 2018. Doesn't get granted. You have to wait for a couple of years down the line. So if you look at the grant data, you'll be getting something which happened 5 years back. So you must be careful with that.
Because it's interesting also in terms of seeing what really works and what doesn't. Even if it's by retrospective, but it could give a better image.
It is possible to work out, yes.
It'll give a better image of 5 years ago, yes.
Boris.
Two simple question on terminology. I see on the spreadsheet that in the last decennial of the 20th century, application for PCT have gone fivefold, and the first two decennials of the new century, 2.5-fold. So does that mean that before people were more dynamic and now they have turned more inventive, or vice versa? And my second question, why between the PCT summaries here and the Madrid, in one case you refer to top fields and the other one top classes?
Okay, the second one is more easy. So the second one, we have classification systems. And they're classification systems, and the classification systems are mainly administrative mechanisms, tools, and especially they were very useful in the pre-computer age, because you had to look at which classes of technology you would search in to see if there were similar applications. So the classification system in the case of patents is a classification system based on technology, the nature of the technology. So it's not based on industrial use or commercial. So it's not like the standard industrial classification. It's a technology classification.
I understand, but of course,
yeah.
we all have in mind that question, how well does this reflect the creativity of society,
Yeah.
the technological progress, the real breakthrough. And this is surely also the main question you have in mind.
I would say that as far as the classifications are concerned, what they're indicating is that there are more patents applications being filed, or the number of patent applications being filed in the areas of digital communication, computer technology is rising, more quickly than in other areas. And then if you look at trademarks, you see the same thing. They're branding more products in computers and electronics than they are in other fields. So we know that those areas are moving, Now, how perfect...
Branding a good or a bad?
Well, it's generally the number of new products, services, or enterprises. So it's not a bad indicator, and in some respects, to some extent, Carsten will say, to some extent, a leading indicator of economic activity. No?
Yeah, sorry.
Robbie and then Jingmei.
Just a small question. Comparing with the report released last December about
Yes.
the patent applications
Worldwide.
I know that the different system, any the coincident cases between the two reports or not?
Yeah, sure, there are. So, as you rightly say, what we did last December is release the total aggregate numbers for the world in every patent office around the world. And here we're dealing with the number of those that get translated into an international application, for other countries. So there are similarities in the trends. I mean, you'll see that, as the number of applications filed in the Chinese patent office has gone up, there's a similar trend for the number of applications that are being internationalised out of that. I mean, they're not exactly the same, and, all things need to be measured properly, but there are broad trends that are similar. Yeah.
What's the difference?
Just to come back to this by field of technology, for example.
Yep.
The figures are very interesting, namely basic communication processes. What would it involve? Would it be a 5G kind of a system?
Yeah. So, look, this is a summary of a reasonably complex classification. There are 72,000 subclasses of technology in it. Okay, so you would have to go to the subclass to answer your question level, and I can't do that off the top of my head. So it's a search that needs. Yeah.
Okay. The other question, wondering whether your figures on India are tailored to make the Indian Prime Minister win the election at a time when there are such regressive social policies which are anti-science, anti-technological. Are you serious when you say all this increase is actually creditable or worthwhile talking about?
No, I think yes. As I said earlier, it would be difficult to say that there are consistent trends, but what we do see, because it's just it's one huge rise in 1 year does not constitute a trend. But what we can say is that India has strengthened its participation in the international intellectual property system. We know that because it joined the Madrid system, and we know that it joined the two 1996 Internet treaties, and it is seriously considering a number of other treaties. We know also that on the whole, the growth rate, the rate of applications filed internationally has been going up. And that's apparent. So let's look at India. Well, you can look at it and you'll see, 20 years ago, 14 applications, 2,000 now. So this is
Phenomenal jump.
Yeah, it's a big jump, okay? So there are, I think, a number of different indicators. Now, the level of that growth and whether we get 27% followed by 20-something% followed, double-digit growths consistently, if we get that for 5 years, we've got a really interesting phenomenon, I
How
think.
does it compare with China?
Look, I wouldn't even want to answer that without, looking at it very carefully. Obviously, the volumes are very different. 2,000 for India, 54,000, 3,000 for China. You're talking about something completely different.
There's no photo.
Yeah, it is something completely different. But, we'd have to come back in 20 years' time to look at that, I think.